They thought they were safe on those dusty trails of the untamed West, riding in a modest wagon train toward a new life, hopes and dreams as wide as the horizon. But safety is a fickle thing in land ruled by gunshots and greed, and in an instant, everything changed. A band of ruthless outlaws descended like a plague, tearing through the travelers without mercy. Little did they know, a determined woman named Rebecca hid her tiny twins among the tall brush, risking her own life in a desperate bid to save theirs. This is a story of grit survival and unimaginable courage. Rebecca O'Connell pressed her palm to her brow, wiping away rivulets of sweat that trickled down her weathered face. The sun above the Oklahoma Territory was relentless, a blazing orb, unyielding in its conquest of the skies. Around her and her family, the wagon train rumbled on. Timber wheels screeched in protest under the weight of furniture, trunks of clothing and keepsakes, dear to those seeking a better life in the new lands. This wagon train was a motley group of pioneers from all corners of the East and South, each one spurred on by promise or desperation. Some dreamed of fertile farmland in California. Others simply yearned for space to breathe away from crowded cities. Rebecca had grown up in a small town outside of St. Louis. Her husband James was once a quiet horse handler who had saved enough to buy a modest piece of land. Their dream was a ranch. They envisioned open fields where their horses could run free, where their children, two bright-eyed twins named Caleb and Caroline, could grow with the land and inherit something greater. Surrounded by the warm companionship of strangers turned friends, they believed they were forging a path to a bright future. Each day the wagons ventured deeper into the frontier. With them traveled hopes, stories, and shared resources. Rebecca's neighbor in the caravan was a kindly older man named Henry Hank Williamson, a Civil War veteran with a white beard that framed his mouth like cotton. Hank had joined this journey because he hoped to establish a small blacksmith shop out west, turning metal scraps into objects of utility and sometimes art. He was also one of the few men armed enough and experienced enough to provide some protection, though no one had expected trouble on this carefully traveled route. That false sense of security hung in the air. The wide plains shimmered in the distance under the punishing sun. In the evenings, the group would gather around campfires, cooking meager stews from salted meat, wild onions, and cornmeal. Music from a harmonica or a banjo sometimes livened the twilight gloom. The children would doze under star-filled skies, lulled to sleep by their parents' hushed bedtime stories. If only they had known what horrors lay just beyond the horizon. Days before the massacre, word trickled in that outlaws notorious for robbing stagecoaches and supply wagons might be roaming these parts. A lanky scout named Charlie Hayes had ridden ahead to check the trail conditions and returned with unsettling news. He had encountered riders rumored to be part of a gang called the Black Talons, a ruthless band of cutthroats and thieves who moved wherever they could evade the law. Some travelers felt a chill roll down their spines at Charlie's tale. Others brushed it off, believing it was little more than frontier gossip. They had grown too comfortable on the open road, lulled into complacency by previous weeks of quiet. To them, the idea of a looming bandit threat seemed distant, especially given that local lawmen, including the legendary Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves, were rumored to patrol the territory. Rebecca felt a knot of worry gather in her gut at the mention of Black Talons. She had overheard James and Hank discussing the group in whispers over the campfire. An evening, according to Hank, some folks said the Black Talons left no witnesses. Their leader, a hardened man by the name of Morris Moe Grissom, was said to have carved a swath of terror from Kansas to New Mexico, picking off stray travelers or poorly guarded caravans. It was rumored Grissom's band carried stolen military rifles and had an uncanny knack for melting away into the rocky hills after each attack. In her corner of the camp, Rebecca laid awake that night, listening to the quiet breaths of her twins. Their small bodies were curled under a single blanket, warm in the glow of the dying embers. In the flickering shadows, her imagination conjured images of marauders with guns ablaze. She vowed to keep her children safe, even if it meant using her father's revolver that she kept hidden in her trunk, a relic from the days he served as a deputy in a sleepy Missouri town. Still, dawn brought some respite. The wagon train seemed intact, no sign of trouble. People rose, poured coffee from tin kettles, and fed their teams. Rebecca tried to brush off her dark thoughts, reminding herself that many rumors in the West were exaggerated. Trouble always lurked out here. But maybe, just maybe, they would be spared. It happened just after midday. The caravan had stopped beside a winding creek water, precious in these parts. Children scampered around, delighted to soak their feet. Women washed clothes in the shallows, hung them to dry on branches. Men took stock of supplies and jugs. It was supposed to be a brief rest, a chance to refresh before they journeyed onward. Rebecca was crouched by the water's edge, scrubbing one of Caleb's shirts. Nearby, James watched the horses drink occasionally, patting their necks reassuringly. Hank strode by, greeting them with the tip of his hat, complaining good-naturedly about the heat. "It's hotter than the devil's oven," he remarked. Then he froze. His gaze drifted past the wagons and into the horizon. A cloud of dust rose. Hoofbeats grew louder. The color drained from Hank's face as he recognized the formation riders advancing quickly too fast to be a friendly approach. His mouth tightened. Men scrambled for rifles. Women and children looked around in confusion, and the sense of dread arrived in a sudden, crushing wave. A voice shouted, "Bandits, get down!" Before anyone could properly react, shots rang out. Gun smoke curled into the air. Panicked screams erupted among the travelers. The air felt acrid, heavy with dread, as bullets whizzed past in all directions. Horses reared and whinnied, some breaking free of their reins. Within seconds, the calm scene devolved into chaos. Rebecca's heart pounded. She saw men falling to the ground under the unrelenting barrage of bullets. Hank fired back valiantly, but he was vastly outnumbered. Across the wagon circle, James tried to gather the children, his eyes scanning urgently for Caleb and Caroline. Rebecca screamed, "Here!" and he locked eyes with her. He shouted something, but his voice was drowned out in the cacophony. Suddenly, a bullet tore through James's shoulder. He staggered, hand pressed to the wound. She watched in horror as another bandit shot him again, a single crack that echoed through her ears as his body collapsed near the horses. The moment froze in time, for Rebecca, her mind unable to process the sight of her husband's limp form. Amid the chaos, the children wailed, eyes wide with terror. Rebecca felt her entire being seize with the maternal drive to protect them. Gunfire rattled the air, and the bandits swept in close malicious whoops and sneers on their lips. She yelled at Caleb and Caroline. "Run into the brush. Hide." They hesitated, their small bodies rooted in fear. But she shoved them both toward a thick copse of juniper and brush, urging them to keep low, to be silent. Their innocent eyes shimmered with terror, but some instinct told them to obey. They scrambled away, disappearing behind tall, dry foliage. Rebecca clasped her father's revolver, her only weapon. She fired blindly at an approaching rider. The bullet must have grazed him, for he cursed and reeled. But more bandits circled like predators, and she had only a few bullets in the chamber. Time seemed to stretch in a sickening blur. Gunshots echoed from all sides, and travelers' screams blended into a single, horrifying wail. The lead bandit, Morris Mo Grissom, reared up on his horse, a large black stallion that stomped at the dusty ground. He barked orders to his men with an air of twisted glee. "Take them all. Spare no one." His voice boomed over the fray, carrying an unmistakable authority and cruelty that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Shot after shot tore through the encampment. Bodies fell, faces contorted in shock and pain. The pandemonium was unimaginable. Some tried to flee, but the bandits tracked them down swiftly, rifles at the ready. Others collapsed into the creek water, turning a grim red. Hank Williamson, the old blacksmith, put up the best fight he could, emptying his shotgun into one of the bandits. But it wasn't enough. Hank took a bullet to the chest and slumped against the wagon, the life leaving him in a ragged gasp. Rebecca lay low, trying to remain invisible. She prayed the bandits wouldn't notice her, her eyes searching desperately for any sign of her children through the swirling dust. Part of her wanted to race toward them, clutch them tight, but she knew doing so would only lead the bandits to their hiding spot. "Stay still," she whispered to herself, as though the words could bridge the distance to her twins. The massacre lasted mere minutes, though it felt like hours. When the gunfire finally ceased, the bandits picked through the wagons, collecting valuables, rummaging through trunks for money, jewelry, or anything they could pawn in the nearby frontier towns. They laughed and joked high on the power of their vicious deed. Bodies lay strewn around the smouldering remains of the wagon circle. The few horses that had not bolted were seized by the gang. Rebecca, bleeding from a graze on her arm, and battered by a harsh blow she'd taken to the temple during the chaos, lay still behind the partial cover of an overturned trunk. Her mind reeled her body, trembling with shock. She heard heavy footsteps crunch across the gravelly soil. One of the bandits rummaged in a wagon just a few feet away. She forced herself not to move, not to draw attention. A new voice rumbled a younger man's, filled with nervous excitement. "Did we get 'em all?" Mo Grissom's answer was casual, cold as stone. "Looks like it. Ain't no one left breathing. Grab the goods, let's ride. The law might be on our tails soon." They were so confident in their butchery, so sure there were no survivors, that they didn't notice the trembling woman behind that trunk. Nor did they suspect the two tiny children crouched in the brush. Rebecca's heart hammered as the bandits mounted their horses and began their triumphant departure. One of them, a tall, gaunt figure with a tattered bandana, stopped briefly to poke a lifeless victim with the tip of his boot. Satisfied there was no movement, he spurred his horse onward. The thunder of hooves receded. But even when silence reigned once more, Rebecca did not rise. She stayed down, her body half paralyzed by shock and fear, afraid the outlaws might still linger. It wasn't until the sun's angle changed the day, creeping toward late afternoon, that she finally forced herself up, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the dreaded riders. They were gone. She scrambled to her feet, limbs shaking uncontrollably, tears threatening to spill at any moment. She ran first to James's body, collapsed near the creek, bullet wounds soaked with blood. In her grief-stricken haze, she knelt beside him, pressing trembling fingers to his face, leaning in to see if any breath remained. His eyes were open but unseeing. A wail escaped her lips, the sound raw, animalistic. Nearby, the bodies of their fellow travelers were strewn about with brutal finality. She saw Hank slumped against the wagon, the same kindly man who had shared with her a tin cup of coffee each morning. Others she had come to call friends lay similarly still. No one stirred. Gradually, Rebecca remembered the children, Caleb and Caroline. She called out, her voice cracking Caleb, Caroline. A delirious fear gripped her. What if the bandits had found them after all? Then movement in the brush. She sprinted towards it, ignoring the stabs of pain in her own body. Her eyes frantically scanned the thick undergrowth. Finally, she saw them. Two small figures hunched under a juniper bush, their eyes wide as saucers. Their faces were tear-stained dust clinging to their cheeks. Ma Caleb cried, bursting from the bush. Caroline followed both children, flinging themselves into their mother's arms. Rebecca embraced them, sobbing with relief, pressing kisses to their sweat-soaked hair. They babbled incoherently, words tumbling out. They had heard the gunfire, the shouting, seen men on horses. They asked if their pa was okay. Rebecca's heart twisted painfully. She didn't know how to tell them. They searched her expression. Tears beginning to form again as they sensed the answer. Finally, with a trembling voice, she said, He's gone, babies. He's with the Lord now." Caleb began to cry silently. Caroline just stared at her mother, face pale. She was the quieter twin, prone to deep thought beyond her years. She clutched at her mother's dress as though trying to anchor herself to a reality that had just shattered. Rebecca had neither the luxury of time nor the capacity to properly grieve. They were alone, their party destroyed, left on a blood-soaked patch of land that offered neither shelter nor solace. The heat pressed down on them, and she had 2 children to keep alive. She swallowed back her anguish, took a few minutes to gather supplies from among the carnage. Anything not stolen or too damaged to use. Her breath caught as she found Hank's old canteen, some dried meat, a few unbroken tins of beans, and a battered water jug. But most of the wagons had been torched, their contents turned to ash or scattered by the bandits. The horses were gone, except for 2 that lay dead, tangled in their harnesses. She realized with a fresh surge of horror that they were stranded without transportation miles from any settlement. Still, she refused to give in to hopelessness. Steeling herself, she guided her twins away from the carnage, sheltering them behind what remained of their wagon, rummaging for a blanket or a piece of cloth that she could use to shield them from the sun. She found Caroline's doll slightly singed, but intact. With trembling hands, she pressed it into her daughter's arms. Before nightfall, she made a decision they would have to leave. Staying at this site was too dangerous, not just for fear of the bandits returning, but for the lack of any resource or protection. Rebecca knew of a small frontier settlement called Tully Fork, about 50 miles back along the wagon trail. If they could somehow make it there, perhaps they could find help. Morning brought a disquieting calm. Birds sang in the brush, oblivious to the horror strewn across the campsite. Rebecca set her children to wait by the creek while she performed a task that wrenched her soul. She buried James. She had no shovel, so she used a dented pan and her bare hands scraping at the dry ground until she formed a shallow grave. The sweat and tears mingled on her face as she labored under the merciless sun. She knew many of the others deserved burials too, but she hadn't the strength or the means. The best she could do was recite a quick prayer over them as a group tears falling freely. She whispered their names: Hank Williamson, Mary Jefferson, the Duncans with their young son, so many more. People she had joked with, broken bread with, shared stories of old times. All gone now, brutally robbed of their futures. Caleb and Caroline watched from a distance, clinging to each other in mute sorrow. When she finished, she led them to James's final resting place. She pressed a small cross made of broken wagon wood into the mound. "We will never forget," she whispered, her voice choked. Rebecca gathered the meager supplies she'd salvaged. She divided the water between 2 canteens. A half sack of flour, some dried jerky, and a single pot were all she had to sustain them on this journey. She draped a scorched blanket over Caleb and Caroline, shading them from the sun as they walked. They headed east, retracing the wagon tracks. Each step felt agonizing, her muscles stiff with fatigue, her mind burdened by grief. The children, still in shock, followed obediently. They walked in silence for hours, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps and the faint sigh of the wind through the plains. Every so often, they paused to rest under whatever shade they could find, scraggly mesquite trees or tall rocks. Rebecca doled out water in careful sips, terrified of running out. The children were young, but they understood thirst. Their eyes told her they were trying to be brave, not whining or complaining, as they might have under normal circumstances. Her greatest fear was that they might encounter the bandits again. Each time she heard a sound in the distance, the distant report of a rifle, the echo of hooves, she froze. But no one emerged on the horizon, for now they were alone. The land itself was unforgiving, a near-endless expanse of scrub and dirt. Occasionally they came upon a small creek or a pond. Rebecca tested the water's cleanliness before letting the children drink. Twice they stumbled upon the remains of a buffalo carcass, likely shot by some hunter weeks ago. This was a land of life and death, and the line between the two was thinner than they had ever realized. At night, they huddled under the blanket together, the children seeking warmth and security in Rebecca's arms. She kept her revolver close, though she only had 3 bullets left. Each night, she found it harder and harder to keep the nightmares at bay. Images of James's final moments worked behind her eyelids. The children, meanwhile, pressed close, jumping at every unfamiliar noise. And still they trudged on. On the 3rd day, as they were resting near a shallow ravine, they heard the sound of a rider approaching. Panic surged in Rebecca, but they had nowhere to hide in the open plains. She told the twins to lie flat, and she cocked her revolver, her heart drumming in her ears. A single rider came into view, an older man in a dusty suit jacket, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't look like the bandits, no bandana across his face, no menacing posture. Spotting Rebecca's upraised revolver, he lifted his hands in a gesture of peace. "Whoa, ma'am," he called out. "I mean you no harm." She hesitated, glancing at her frightened children. The man dismounted slowly, showing he had no weapon drawn. "Name's Kyle Farnsworth. I'm a circuit judge heading to Fort Smith. You folks all right?" The question was absurd under the circumstances. Rebecca lowered her gun, tears springing to her eyes as the weight of the last few days threatened to break her. "No, not all right. We were attacked," she managed to say. Judge Farnsworth's expression turned grim. He invited them to his small camp, just over the ridge, where he had a single pack mule carrying provisions. He offered water, some beans, and a chance to rest. It was the first real act of kindness they'd experienced since that awful day. As they sat by his fire, Rebecca told him about the massacre, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and rage. Farnsworth listened intently occasionally, nodding, his face lined with sympathy and indignation at the bandits' cruelty. "I've heard of these black talons," he muttered. "Law's been after them for a while, but they slip through every time. Terrible business." He insisted on aiding them. "I'm no man of significant wealth or power, but if there's one thing I can do, it's help you get somewhere safe. I need to reach Fort Smith to oversee trials, But I can divert to Tully Fork, see you delivered to a doctor at least." Rebecca hesitated. She wanted justice, but she had her twins to think about. Farnsworth, though small in stature, carried an air of authority and sincere concern. She relented. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you, sir." 2 more days passed on the trail, but the presence of Judge Farnsworth was an enormous relief. He had a horse for himself and a mule that the children could ride whenever they grew too weary to walk. Rebecca insisted on walking for the most part, determined to save the animal's strength. Finally, on a cool morning, they spotted Tully Fork, a collection of wooden buildings lining a single dirt road with a few outlying ranches. The settlement was hardly more than a frontier stop, but to Rebecca it looked like salvation. They found the local doctor, a weary-eyed woman named Dr. Alice McGuinness, who had established a small clinic. She cleaned Rebecca's wounds, checked the children for signs of dehydration, and offered them a place to stay for a few nights. Farnsworth covered the costs. "It's the least I can do," he said. During their stay, word of the massacre spread quickly through the town. A few local ranchers expressed outrage. They lamented that with the nearest federal marshal station so far away, bandits often terrorized travelers. Dr. McGuinness commented, "I've treated survivors of such raids before. It's inexcusable. We need more lawmen on these trails." Rebecca, though grateful for the rest, felt her anger grow each day. The memory of the massacre burned behind her eyes, James falling, the anguish of burying him in haste. She knew her children needed her, needed stability, but she also felt compelled to see justice done. On their final evening in Tully Fork, Farnsworth took Rebecca aside. "I know it might seem that your journey is done," he said quietly, "but you strike me as someone who won't find peace until these men are brought to account." Rebecca felt tears threaten to well up. "They killed everyone," she whispered. "They killed my husband. They left my children fatherless. They must be made to stand trial." Farnsworth agreed, his expression grave. "But the law needs witnesses, and we need men brave enough to chase these devils down." Guilt and fury wrestled in Rebecca's heart. She was just a pioneer woman, not a gunslinger. She had children to raise, yet the desire for retribution was a flame that only grew. "What can I do?" she asked finally. Farnsworth placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves is in Fort Smith. He's one of the best. If anyone can bring them in, it's him. And having your testimony might be crucial." She looked at him, a swirl of conflicting emotions raging within her. It terrified her to think of stepping back into the path of these outlaws. But if she did nothing, they would strike again and again. Thus the seed was planted. Rebecca resolved that once she secured a safe place for Caleb and Caroline, she would do everything in her power to see those killers pay. Finding a secure environment for her children was Rebecca's first priority. Through Dr. McGuinness, she met a gentle widow named Eliza Farnsworth, Judge Farnsworth's sister, who ran a small lodging house. Eliza was unable to have children of her own, and immediately took to the twins with a maternal warmth. "I can look after them while you're away," Eliza offered kindly, though confusion flickered in her eyes. She couldn't understand why a mother would leave her young children, especially after such trauma. But she recognized the fierce determination in Rebecca's gaze. The twins were reluctant to let their mother leave, especially after all they had endured. Caroline clung to Rebecca's dress, tears gathering. Caleb tried to be brave, but his trembling hands betrayed him. "Babies," Rebecca said softly, kneeling down to their level. "I have to do this. The men who hurt us, who took Pa away. They need to face the law. That's the only way we can find peace." She stroked their hair, heartbreaking at the thought of leaving them behind. But Eliza promised to care for them as though they were her own. Leaving Tully Fork with Judge Farnsworth, who was heading that way for his circuit duties, Rebecca's heart was heavy. Yet every mile that passed, her resolve hardened. She vowed not to let fear or sorrow stop her. The journey to Fort Smith took them through rolling hills, patches of forest, and winding roads carved out by wagon wheels. Fort Smith, a bustling frontier city on the Arkansas River, loomed into view at last. It was larger than anything Rebecca had seen since leaving St. Louis ships docking at the waterfront rows of wooden storefronts and a tall brick courthouse that served as a symbol of federal authority in the wild territory. They arrived in the late afternoon, the streets buzzing with people on horseback and on foot. Judge Farnsworth led Rebecca through the courthouse doors. Inside, the halls were filled with people lawyers, officers, outlaws in shackles awaiting their fate. The tension in the air was palpable. The judge directed her to the office of Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves, who was reputed to be one of the most tenacious lawmen to ever serve in the Indian Territory. Rebecca had heard stories of Reeves, how he was born into slavery, gained his freedom during the Civil War, and went on to become a legend in these parts. Bass Reeves stood behind a sturdy desk poring over wanted posters. He was a tall man with a commanding presence and a quiet intensity that made many criminals quake. His hair was graying at the temples, and he had a mustache that accentuated his stern features. When Rebecca entered, he nodded respectfully. Judge Farnsworth introduced them briefly, relaying the story of the massacre. Reeves listened occasionally, glancing at Rebecca, with a mixture of empathy and resolve. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm, "I'm truly sorry for your loss. The Black Talons, I've been chasing them on and off for months, always slip away. They're cunning. But your account is invaluable. We don't often have witnesses that survive their attacks." Rebecca swallowed hard. "I want to help. I can show you where it happened. I can tell you what I saw. Anything that helps you catch them." Reeves studied her for a moment, seeing something in her eyes that confirmed her determination. "We'll find them," he said. "But you need to know this is dangerous work. We'll be heading deep into Indian territory. The law is thin. I can't promise your safety if you ride along." "I understand," she replied, a tremor in her voice. "But they killed everyone I cared for." A flicker of admiration crossed Reeves's face. He reached for a fresh, wanted poster bearing the name Maurice Mo Grissom, with a rough sketch that matched the man who had led the massacre. The reward was sizable. "We've got an open bounty on these men," Reeves said. "I aim to collect it and see them stand before the judge. You ready to join my posse?" Rebecca nodded, ignoring the thrum of nerves in her gut. It was time to finish what the bandits had started, time to ensure no one else had to endure the horrors she had witnessed. Deputy Marshal Reeves sent out word to a few reliable cowboys and scouts he trusted. Over the next 2 days, they trickled into Fort Smith, summoned by the call for justice or the lure of reward money. Among them was a burly ex-Texas Ranger known as Jed Coleman, quiet but lethal with a rifle. A wiry Cherokee tracker named Tsali Ridgewalker, whose knowledge of the terrain was unparalleled, and a freedman named Gideon Brown, who had once been part of Reeves's posse in chasing other outlaws. When they heard Rebecca's story, the men's expressions hardened. They harbored no illusions about what they were up against. The Black Talons were rumored to be nearly 20 men, all hardened criminals. But Reeves and his small band had skill cunning, and now a witness with a personal stake in bringing them down. They spent evenings strategizing. Tzali spread out a hand-drawn map on the table in Reeves's cramped office, pointing to areas where the gang might be holed up. "They like the rocky hills near Snake River," he said in a low voice. "Plenty of places to hide. Can cross into Oklahoma territory or the nations swiftly." Reeves nodded, eyes narrowed. "We'll have to track them carefully. If they see us coming, they'll vanish." Jed Coleman spit into a spittoon, crossing his arms. "Sure you want to bring the lady along?" he asked Reeves pointedly. "No offense, ma'am, but this ain't no place for a woman." Rebecca bristled, but before she could speak, Reeves answered his tone unyielding. "She's the only one who can identify Grissom for sure, aside from me and a couple of wanted posters. We might need that, and if she wants to help, that's her right." Jed shrugged, letting the matter drop. Rebecca appreciated Reeves's words, though she understood the danger. Yet her fury and grief burned too hot to be extinguished by fear. Setting out from Fort Smith, the posse traveled days through rough country. They passed abandoned homesteads, dusty roads, and occasional small settlements. Along the way, they questioned folks who might have seen the Black Talons ride through. Some had glimpsed suspicious riders, but the information was sketchy. Each night, they made camp under the stars. The men would sip coffee, share war stories, or sing frontier ballads in low voices. Rebecca would lie awake, staring at the constellations, thinking of James, thinking of the twins hopefully safe with Eliza. On the 5th day, they came across a stagecoach station that had been burned to the ground. The stench of ash and charred wood filled the air. Inside, they found 3 bodies shot dead. The station's strongbox had been emptied. Reeves's jaw tightened. "Looks like their handiwork." Rebecca felt rage surge anew. So many innocent people. She knelt beside the station keeper's body, whispering a silent prayer. This had to end. Tzali found footprints, hoof tracks indicating at least a dozen riders heading west. The posse gathered their gear, determination fueling them onward. Late afternoon on the 2nd week of their hunt, Tzali spotted movement on a distant ridge. Through binoculars, Gideon confirmed it was the Black Talons. He recognized Grissom's tall figure and black stallion, plus about 15 other riders. They seemed relaxed, possibly confident that no lawman would dare track them so deep in this territory. Reeves ordered everyone to dismount and approach on foot, using the natural cover of the ravine and boulders. The plan was to surround them quietly if possible and demand their surrender before bullets started flying. With outlaws this lethal, though a peaceful outcome seemed unlikely. Rebecca's heart thundered. She clutched her revolver, her father's old weapon, which now seemed so small compared to the rifles and shotguns carried by the posse. She recalled the bandits' laughter, their brutal efficiency in slaughtering everyone she knew. Her hand trembled, but she steadied herself by thinking of the twins. They crept closer, step by painstaking step, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Suddenly, a sentry bandit perched on a rock spotted movement. He fired a warning shot, yelling, "Lawmen! Lawmen!" Pandemonium erupted. Shots rang out as the outlaws scrambled for cover, returning fire. Reeves shouted for the posse to spread out, hugging the ground, to avoid the lethal hail of bullets. The canyon walls echoed with gunfire. Rebecca took cover behind a large boulder, fear pounding in her chest. She peered around, seeing muzzle flashes from the bandits' position. Gideon and Jed fired back, their aim deadly. One bandit toppled off his perch with a grunt. Grissom's voice rose above the chaos, cursing, rallying his men. He recognized Reeves, bellowing, "The marshal's here, boys! Fill him full of lead." Amid the chaos, Rebecca saw movement up the slope. It was Grissom spurring his black stallion, trying to escape. 2 other outlaws fired behind them to cover his retreat. Anger surged in her veins. She scrambled from her cover, ignoring the whiz of bullets overhead. Reeves caught sight of her. "Rebecca!" he shouted. "Stay down!" But she was already moving, driven by memories of her husband lying lifeless near the creek. She chased after Grissom, her feet slipping on loose gravel. Her lungs burned, her heart hammered. She had only 3 bullets. The image of James's final breath fueled her. The black stallion sped ahead. Grissom bent low. He glanced back, eyes widening when he recognized her. A savage grin twisted his face. He slowed just enough to line up his revolver. A bullet whistled past her shoulder. She dove behind a rock. Her mind raced. She could let him go and hope Reeves caught him, or she could try to stop him herself. She glanced down at her old gun, remembering her father's lessons on the farm, the hours spent learning how to steady her aim. She rose just enough to see the outline of Grissom in the saddle. Another shot rang out, sparking off the rock in front of her. Gritting her teeth, she aimed, exhaled, squeezed the trigger. Her bullet hit the stallion's flank. The horse jerked, neighing in pain, stumbling. Grissom cursed, toppling from the saddle. Rebecca scrambled closer, reloading. She had 2 bullets left. Grissom's men were scattered, some pinned down by Reeves and the posse. She needed to finish this. Grissom crouched, gun in hand, eyes wild. He recognized her, though dust and sweat streaked her face. "You," he spat, voice laced with contempt, "should have died with the rest." Rebecca's hand trembled on her revolver. She could end him right there. But her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Uphold the law. Don't let vengeance cloud your eyes. I want you to stand trial." She managed her voice, shaking. "For all the people you've killed." He bared his teeth. "I ain't going to no trial." In a blur, he raised his gun. She fired first. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, knocking him flat. Grissom gasped in hot, his weapon clattering away. Rebecca rushed forward, kicking his gun further. Her breath came in ragged gulps as she pressed her remaining bullet to his forehead, wanting to pull the trigger to rid the world of his evil. But she hesitated. A large figure appeared, Bass Reeves. "Ma'am," he said softly but firmly. "Let's do this right." She stared down at Grissom, wanting nothing more than to end his life. But something in Reeves's tone, the moral code he embodied, froze her trigger finger. Instead, she lowered the gun, tears streaming down her face. "He's yours," she whispered. Reeves nodded. They cuffed Grissom as the sounds of gunfire faded behind them. The rest of the Black Talons who weren't shot down in the skirmish either fled or were apprehended by the posse. By dusk, 6 outlaws lay dead, and 5 were in chains, including their leader. Weeks passed, but the memory of the massacre still burned fresh in Rebecca's heart. The trial of Morris Moe Grissom and the captured Black Talons became one of the most watched proceedings in Fort Smith's history. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, murmuring with curiosity and outrage. Word had spread fast about the wagon train, ambushed about the woman who had survived, and about her brave stand alongside Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves. Inside the courthouse, presided over by the formidable Judge Isaac Parker, known across the frontier as the Hanging Judge, the mood was grim and electric. Parker's reputation was legendary. He had sentenced more outlaws to death than any other judge in the territory, and he carried no sympathy for those who terrorized the innocent. Rebecca sat in the witness chair, her hands trembling as she recounted every moment of the massacre. Her voice cracked as she described the screams, The chaos, the sound of gunfire, and the sight of her husband falling lifeless to the earth. The courtroom was silent, except for her voice, and the quiet weeping of some townsfolk in the back rows, settlers and travelers who had known victims or feared they might one day meet a similar fate. Grissom, seated with his surviving men, sneered as she spoke, but Rebecca held his gaze. Her scars were still healing, but she was no longer afraid. Each word she spoke was like a stone laid down in a monument to the dead. She spoke not only for James and Hank, but for every soul lost that day. The defense tried to paint the outlaws as misunderstood men of hardship, claiming mistaken identity, lack of evidence. But Judge Parker was unmoved. The testimonies combined with the recovered stolen goods, the matching descriptions and the confessions pried from 2 of the captured men, made the truth undeniable. Parker's verdict was swift and final. For the heinous crimes committed against defenseless pioneers, men, women, and children, and for the utter disregard for law and life. I sentence you all to hang by the neck until dead. Gasps rippled through the room. Even though many expected the outcome, the weight of those words brought a finality that hit hard. Rebecca remained still, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. She didn't smile. There was no joy in watching men be sentenced to die. But there was a sense of justice, cold, steady, and necessary. When the gavel fell echoing off the high courtroom walls, something inside her released. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of peace. Weeks later, a scaffold was built behind the courthouse. It was a hot, cloudless day when Grissom and 4 of his gang were led to the gallows. A crowd gathered in grim silence. Rebecca stood toward the back, her twins safely far away in Tully Fork. She watched as the hangman fitted the nooses and Judge Parker read the final orders. Grissom looked out over the crowd, no longer the proud outlaw, but a broken man awaiting judgment. He locked eyes with Rebecca just before the hood was drawn over his face. There was no redemption in his expression, no apology, just defeat. The trapdoors opened. When it was over, Rebecca turned away. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not for the condemned, but for all she had lost. Yet beneath that sorrow was something else, resolve. She had survived. She had fought back. And justice had been served not with revenge, but with the law. Her journey was far from over, but the ghosts of that horrific day no longer held her captive. The wagon that brought Rebecca back to Tully Fork creaked over the familiar dirt road, a trail now etched with both sorrow and significance. She sat at the edge of the seat, her heart fluttering with anticipation and dread. Every mile that drew her closer to the town also brought her nearer to her twins, Caleb and Carolyn, their faces etched into her memory like a sacred painting. It had only been weeks since she had left them in Eliza Farnsworth's care, but it felt like years. She had hunted down the men who destroyed their family, testified in court, and watched justice swing from the gallows. But this homecoming was the moment she had clung to during every sleepless night on the trail. Tully Fork came into view at last. The morning sun bathed the town in golden light, softening the worn facades of the saloon, the general store, and the weathered chapel steeple. Though it was small and unassuming, it looked to Rebecca like the gates of something new, a future just beginning to bloom from the ashes of tragedy. The wagon slowed to a halt outside Eliza Farnsworth's lodging house. Rebecca barely waited for the wheels to still before leaping down her boots, striking the dusty ground. The door of the house creaked open, and Eliza stepped out onto the porch, her kind face lighting up with relief and recognition. "They're out back," she said softly, already stepping aside. Rebecca didn't answer. She ran around the house, her skirts gathering dust and twigs. Her breath caught halfway in her chest. And then she saw them. Caleb and Caroline were playing in the tall grass behind the house, chasing each other beneath the wide open sky. Their laughter rang like bells, clear and bright. For a moment she just stood there, watching, afraid that if she called out, the image would vanish like a mirage. But then Caleb turned and saw her. "Ma!" he shouted. Both children sprinted toward her arms, outstretched eyes wide with disbelief. Rebecca dropped to her knees as they collided into her embrace, all three of them clinging to one another with desperate sobs and half-spoken words. She kissed their hair. Their cheeks whispered their names over and over, as though she could bring time to a halt and live forever in that one moment. "You came back," Caroline murmured against her shoulder, her small hands fisting into Rebecca's dress. "I promised I would." Rebecca choked out, holding them tighter. "And I always keep my promises." Inside the house, Eliza watched from the window, a hand pressed to her chest and tears in her eyes. She had seen many things in her life, but few as raw and beautiful as that reunion. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, curled beside her, Rebecca sat with Eliza on the porch. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the town in hues of pink and gold. Crickets had begun to chirp in the brush, and somewhere in the distance a fiddle played from a saloon balcony. Rebecca said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," the widow replied, handing her a warm mug of tea. "Those children needed safety. You needed time to do what had to be done. That's what neighbors are for." Rebecca nodded, but her mind was already turning to what came next. The past was behind her, but the future demanded attention. She had no home, no income, and 2 children to raise in a land that remained unforgiving. "What will you do now?" Eliza asked gently. "I'm not sure," Rebecca admitted. "James and we had a plan. A ranch, a place to call our own. But that dream burned with the wagon train. All I have left is what I brought back in my heart." Eliza tilted her head thoughtfully. "Tully Fork may be small, but it's not without opportunity. There's land for sale, cheap too, since most folks are afraid to venture out after what happened. Some of the ranchers want help, and you've got more grit than most men I know." That night, Rebecca lay awake beside her children, listening to their soft, even breaths. She had faced fire and blood, watched the man she loved die and stared down evil without flinching. She was no longer just a wife or a mother. She was a survivor, a witness, a fighter, and now she was ready to become something else entirely. Someone who could rebuild not just her life, but a piece of the West that had once tried to break her. Within 2 weeks, Rebecca purchased a small parcel of land on the outskirts of town. It was nothing but raw soil and a crumbling shed, but to her it was sacred ground. With the reward money she received from the U.S. Marshals for aiding in the capture of the Black Talons, she bought a horse, some chickens, and a small wagon. The rest she saved in the name of her children, tucked away in a bank account Eliza helped her set up. The townspeople, many of whom had heard her story, rallied to help. A few ranchers lent her tools, others offered scrap wood to rebuild the shed. Children from the school brought her flowers and sweets, drawn to her quiet strength and kind smile. She started a garden, first rows of beans, squash, and corn. The soil was stubborn, but she was more stubborn. Caleb and Caroline helped each afternoon after school. Their hands small, but determined, their laughter returning more freely with each passing day. In time, she built a new home, modest, single-roomed, but filled with warmth. The walls were bare at first, but slowly life filled them. A doll for Caroline, a hand-carved horse for Caleb, a Bible resting on the windowsill open to Psalms, wild flowers in a tin cup by James's photograph. Rebecca visited James's grave by the creek when she could. She planted wild flowers there too, the same ones that bloomed outside their new home. She knelt in silence each time, sometimes praying, sometimes just remembering. "You'd be proud," she whispered, once brushing dirt from the makeshift wooden cross. "We're going to be just fine." Months passed, the seasons turned, the nightmares faded, and Rebecca O'Connell's name became something of a legend in Tully Fork, not because she chased outlaws or stood in court, but because she rebuilt her life with steady hands and an unshakable will. One evening, a young settler approached her at the general store. "Ma'am," he said with awe in his voice, "is it true? You were with the marshal when they caught the Black Talons?" Rebecca paused, then smiled faintly. "I was," she said, "but that's not the most important thing I've done." "What is then?" She looked out the window at Caleb and Caroline laughing in the wagon outside, their faces clean and free of fear. Raising them, she replied. And with that, she tipped her hat, paid for her goods, and stepped back into the light of a life she had rebuilt. One stitch of courage, one seed of hope at a time. And there you have it, the harrowing journey of Rebecca O'Connell, who refused to let a massacre define her family's destiny. Amid gun smoke and heartbreak, she found the resolve to stand against evil in a lawless land, ensuring that the men who tore her world apart would never strike again. But beyond revenge, Rebecca discovered hope and community in a small frontier town, forging a new life for her children, and refusing to let grief eclipse love. Her story is a testament to human resilience, the power of justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family. If you've been moved by Rebecca's courage and perseverance, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Every comment and share helps us bring more untold Western tales of triumph and tragedy to life. Together we keep these stories alive and honor the spirit of those who dared to dream on the dusty trails of the Wild West.